The cold January evening of January 19th, 1965, was settling over the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia. The sky was clear, but the air was frosty and biting. The time was approaching 5:40 p.m., and long blue shadows were already stretching across the snow-covered ground around the Augusta County Archery Club, where William Blackburn worked. William, a man in his 30s accustomed to physical labor and outdoor activity, was finishing his daily tasks, putting away equipment, checking the locks on the service buildings located a short distance from the main shooting range. He was alone. The silence was broken only by the crunch of snow under his boots and his own breath puffing out in clouds of vapor. He was thinking about the upcoming dinner in the warmth of his home in Waynesboro. Suddenly, his peripheral vision caught some movement in the darkening sky. He looked up, expecting to see an airplane or perhaps a late bird. But what he saw made him freeze. In the sky, against the still bright western horizon, two objects moved smoothly and completely silently. They were disc-shaped, metallic, but their color was strange, not gray or silver, but a kind of dull yellow with a matte metallic sheen, unlike any alloy he knew. The objects were clearly different in size. One was noticeably larger than the other. They moved in sync, as if connected by an invisible thread. For a few moments, they hung motionless, and then the smaller of the two discs began to descend smoothly. The descent was perfect, without wobbling, without sound, as if the object were sliding on invisible rails. It came lower and lower, heading towards an open patch of ground near the service buildings where Blackburn stood. William, stunned and disbelieving his eyes, stepped back a couple of paces, his heart pounding in his chest. The smaller object landed gently on the snowy ground about 18 yards, around 16 to 17 meters, from where William stood. The landing was so light that the snow beneath it barely compressed. The craft wasn't very large, maybe 5 to 6 meters in diameter, and had the same yellowish metallic color as it did in the sky. It rested on short supports or simply on its flat bottom. The larger object, meanwhile, remained hovering high in the sky, motionless and silent, as if observing. Before William could recover from the sight of the landed craft, on its smooth surface, where one might logically expect a door or hatch, but where there were no visible seams, a section of the hull silently slid aside or retracted inwards, revealing a dark opening. And from this opening, they emerged. 3 figures. They were small, about 3 feet tall, less than a meter. Their bodies were completely covered in tight-fitting jumpsuits of the same strange yellow metallic color as their craft. The jumpsuits shimmered in the dim evening light as if made of foil or some unknown plastic. The figures moved stiffly, somewhat awkwardly, but purposefully. They exited the craft and headed directly towards William. As they came a little closer, Blackburn could see them better, and fear turned into almost panic-stricken terror. Their proportions were non-human. Their heads seemed slightly large for their small bodies, although facial details were hard to make out due to the distance and twilight. But what really caught the eye were their hands. On each hand, as far as he could see, there was only one finger, but this finger was disproportionately long, thin, and looked more like some kind of tool or manipulator than part of a living being. And the eyes. Oh, those eyes. They were large, dark, and held no pupils or whites. But the most terrifying thing was the feeling they evoked. It seemed they weren't looking at him, but through him, penetrating somewhere deep inside, reading his thoughts, his fear. It was a cold, scrutinizing, completely inhuman gaze that made his blood run cold. The aliens approached slowly but relentlessly. They were already about 15 yards away, then 12 yards, around 11 meters. William felt an icy terror grip him. What did they want? Were they going to attack? Take him? The instinct for self-preservation took over. Near the shed stood an axe he had used earlier to chop wood. Not thinking clearly from fear, Blackburn lunged for it, grabbed the heavy tool, and raised it, holding it out in front of him. He froze in a tense stance, ready to defend himself or die. Seeing this, the being stopped. Their non-human eyes remained fixed on him. They stood motionless for several seconds, as if assessing the situation. Then one of them emitted several sounds. The sounds were quiet, clicking or gurgling, completely unlike human speech and utterly unintelligible. They seemed to exchange a few such phrases among themselves. Then, just as suddenly as they had stopped, all three turned and headed back towards their craft. They moved with the same stiff, mechanical gait. They approached the craft. The door, which seemed to have vanished, materialized again out of nowhere. A dark opening simply appeared. The beings disappeared inside one by one. The opening closed just as silently, the craft's surface becoming perfectly smooth again. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the craft lifted silently off the ground, rose smoothly several meters, hovered for a second, and shot upwards with incredible speed, joining its larger companion still hanging high in the sky. Both objects, large and small, flashed brightly yellow for an instant, then sped away rapidly and disappeared over the horizon, leaving William Blackburn alone in the snowy clearing, axe in his trembling hands, heart pounding. He stood there for a long time afterward, trying to compose himself, staring at the empty sky. The cold chilled him to the bone, but he didn't feel it. When the shock subsided slightly, he walked over to where the craft had landed. On the snow, only shallow, almost imperceptible marks remained from the supports or the craft's bottom, which were quickly being covered by the wind. No other traces, no smell. William barely slept that night. The image of the yellow figures with one finger and the piercing eyes haunted him. He told no one about what happened, afraid of ridicule, afraid of being thought crazy. But the secret weighed heavily on him. After some time, he did confide in a few people he trusted. The story leaked to the local press. And that's when the strangest part began. Shortly after the publication, as Blackburn later reported to investigators, he was visited by two men. They didn't introduce themselves, wore severe dark suits, and acted officially and coldly. They questioned him in detail about the incident, but their interest seemed controlling rather than investigative. They didn't threaten him directly, but strongly advised him not to talk about the story anymore, not to speak with journalists or ufologists, hinting that it might not be in his best interest and not in the interest of national security. Their visit left William with an oppressive sense of fear and the feeling that he had encountered not only aliens, but also some shadowy government structure trying to suppress the truth. This fact of pressure and the attempt to silence Blackburn was later corroborated by Richard Hallam and his colleagues from NICAP, who conducted an independent investigation into the case. They managed to find circumstantial evidence suggesting that William had indeed been pressured and was forced to stop discussing his contact. Despite this, the researchers were still able to gather some additional details. It turned out that Blackburn's encounter occurred in an area where another UFO sighting and alleged landing had been reported less than a month earlier, although without entity contact. This proximity in time and place of the two incidents added weight to William's story and suggested a possible local flap of UFO activity in Virginia during that period. William Blackburn's case, though not as widely known as some others, remains an important piece in the puzzle of ufological research, a testimony of a close encounter, a description of strange beings, and, significantly, a hint at possible information suppression by authorities. For Blackburn himself, that brief but terrifying episode in the snowy clearing became an event that forever changed his life and left more questions than answers.